Welcome everybody to the webinar this afternoon, and we hope that it will be a very interesting session and as interactive as possible for everybody. As you will know, we've had a significant number of registrations for this meeting, so we've had to change the format slightly. I'm just going to introduce the housekeeping for the meeting this afternoon. As I've already explained, the session is recorded and will be available to watch again on YouTube. All of our delegates are on mute, and we would be really grateful if people stayed on mute. We have too many people to have direct verbal questions, I'm afraid, and we ask everybody to also keep your webcams off so that it doesn't crowd up the screen too much. So, as a welcome to the afternoon, this is our live discussion session for the supporting the webinars around the pathway to test guidelines from science to standards for nanomaterials. As you know, we had a lot of registrations for this event. In fact, we had over 850 registrations in the end, which required a slight change of format so that everybody could be as interactive as possible. So what we have now is that we had 3 pre-recorded presentations which have been available on YouTube since yesterday morning, and we just replayed those before the start of this live session. And those 3 presentations were an introduction to standards and test guidelines for nanomaterials, the role of processes of OECD for global test guideline development, and finally a spotlight on test guideline updates for nanomaterials. People that watched those presentations were then able to submit questions, which we have grouped together and will answer this afternoon to our best abilities. We have not been able to answer all of the questions if they were submitted quite recently, because we had to go through and process them all. However, we will be accepting questions through the chat function today, and after we have had the end of our pre-prepared question and answer session, we will try and find the time to answer any other questions submitted through the chat function. If we run out of time to do that, we will answer all of the questions submitted through the chat function in writing and share that in a set of frequently asked questions with people afterwards. The same goes for some of the more complex questions that we received through the online messaging or through the online question submission platform, because where we had questions that were extremely technically specific or slightly further away from the topic of the webinar, it's easier for us to do that in writing than as part of the webinar directly. So you can see down here on your screen, hopefully it's not covered up by a little grey box, is you can see where the chat function is at the bottom. And so please just click on that and share the questions with everybody, and we will feed those through to our presenters after we've addressed the initial questions. So our presenters today are Thomas Kulbusch from Bauer, they are Mar Gonzalez from OECD, and they are Eric Bleeker from RAVM. And we've already seen their presentations available on YouTube, and I would really like to thank them again for all of the hard work that they have done in preparing their presentations for this meeting.
Claire?
Yes, Thomas.
The slides are not moving on, at least on my screen.
That's great. Hopefully that's come back into focus again. I think every time I have to go and let somebody in, it seems to pause the sharing. I'm sure that is operator error than something that is wrong with Zoom. So can you now see the questions in focus today?
Yes.
That is good. So hopefully that is fine. So what we have today is, as I've said, we gathered together a lot of the questions that were submitted over the last 18 hours from people watching the webinars that were recorded online. And so thank you very much indeed for that. We have split the questions that we had into different groups, and now we have Thomas and Mar and Eric and indeed Klaus also available to answer the questions. So we're going to jump straight into those questions now. So the first one on our list here, we had the initial group was more general OECD questions. So we will start with the first question, and I think this one is to Mar, which is, what is the expected time before the MAD can be agreed by OECD member states. So, Mar, do you want to address this question first?
Yes, thank you so much for the presentation and for the questions today, because it will also help us to fine-tune our presentations in the near future and to respond to and to see where we are perhaps need to make more emphasis. I think when I saw this question, I was a little bit, I think what is meant here is how much time it takes for a test guideline to be agreed by to go through the OECD process, and I think in this case it will depend, because you will really need to have the science behind, and it depends how much test you have been able to advance on that, is how fast you will go through the OECD process. It's different. Once a test guideline is already approved by the OECD, then it's automatically accepted by it's automatically part of the mutual acceptance of data. So this includes is for all the chemicals, including nanomaterials. So I think there is no time frame, or there is no waiting time between the acceptance and its inclusion in the mutual acceptance of data. Perhaps something to note here is we are discussing, and you saw in the presentations that we have the help and the collaboration with some EU projects like Nanoharmony. So I think the fact that you have this big international effort in producing the data and delivering the draft test guidelines for the OECD to cope with them, this will shorten the time for their approval. But you should think about, it can go as fast as 2 years, but it can go as lengthy as 6 or more years. It really depends on how much data you have in the beginning.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Mar. So I hope that was a useful answer to our first question. We move on to our next question, which is, does the OECD see a future? Are there further adaptations to standards and test guidelines required? And I think Eric was going to comment on that first, followed by Mar.
Yes, thanks. Thanks for this question. It's not necessarily the OECD that sees the further adaptation, although we are all OECD in a way. But as Mar also pointed out, and I did as well in my presentation, it's regulatory needs that drive whether adaptations on OECD, or at least whether new test guidelines are needed, and whether adaptation is needed for existing ones. That depends a bit on the science that's progressing, because clearly new insights will in some cases also give new insights on test guidelines and how they are performed, or how they should be performed.
Okay,
anything
thank you,
to
Eric.
add, Mar?
Mar, did you want to add to that as well?
No, I think just also to reiterate what Eric said. I mean, it's not the OECD who will decide which test guidelines or which guidance document is needed. I think what we do is just to be the recipient, and then just to assist countries in finding a common ground on whether this is a common need and whether we can include it as part of our process. But the need really comes, it's a data requirement, it's an amendment in law that will be triggering this at the national level, and then they will come to our end.
Okay, thank you very much. And that does lead on to our next question as well, which is, are the OECD test guidelines legally required? And I know that Eric was going to address this.
Yes, thanks, Claire. In general, it's not the case that they are legally required. It's many of the legislations, unless they specifically refer to OECD test guidelines, they will require specific endpoints or information on endpoints which can be gathered via an OECD test guideline. And thus, the test guideline itself is usually aiming at identifying hazards for a specific chemical, and it's that hazard information that's usually the legislations are asking for, and not necessarily an OECD test guideline to get to that requirements or data.
Thanks very much indeed, Eric. And that's linked to our next question again, which is, can the OECD test guidelines be replaced through other internationally recognized test guidelines? And that is for Ma.
Okay, I think we have to, one thing that needs to be recognized is that the adherence to the OECD Council Acts and to the and MID does not preclude the use or acceptance of test data obtained in accordance with other scientifically valid and specified test methods as developed for specific chemicals product areas. I think in general and in almost all the cases, MAD countries use OECD test guidelines conducted through the GLP, through the good laboratory practice. But there are some exceptions for the preclinical pharmaceutical tests conducted using, for example, what's the International Council for Harmonization test and GLP. So yes, you can use other internationally valid methods as long as it's part of the legal requirements of the country where you want to submit your data.
That's great. Thank you very much, Ma. We're actually going to skip past the next question, which I left in error, but we will answer that in writing, if that's okay, as part of the FAQs that are published at the end of this webinar. So we move to the next question, which is, how are test guidelines validated?
So is that me again?
It is.
Okay. So I think one of the, and I think I mentioned this in my presentation, what you really want to have with the validation is to have a trust environment. You have to make sure that the government or the regulators can take a decision based on the information that you have, okay? So the purpose of the validation study is to learn about the applicability and the accuracy of a proposed experimental routine. You want to know whether the described procedures are interpreted and implemented correctly. You want to identify whether there are factors that can affect the result variability and perform the analysis of statistical variability. It's a document that will accompany the test guideline at the end, and that it will report how you designed your round-robin test. It will describe the procedures, for example, which laboratories participated, what was the study design, the chemical tested, whether there was a validation of the results, what are the conclusions. And one thing that is useful also to ensure the trust in this validation is that they are published as supporting materials at the same time of the test guidelines. So to perform the validation, I mean, you do have to put a lot of resources, because you will need to have inter-laboratory exercise, and you will have to document all that in this validation study that is then published. I hope I have responded to that question.
No, that's great, thank you. And that takes us to the final question here, which was, where can I find online sources of information? And I think that is for Eric to answer right now.
Okay, yes. The latest list of OECD test guidelines in general is publicly available at the OECD website. The current available ones on Nanomaterials, those are the 6 documents that I had in my presentation, and there are links on that same slide as well. So, and that basically leads you to the website of OECD, where all information on testing of chemicals, both guidelines and guidance documents, can be found, and also the other information further on mutual acceptance of data and all other information OECD has on this. So I would refer to my presentation for that.
That's great. And those presentations will be available in a slide version following this webinar to everybody that takes part. And of course, you can always watch the videos again.
Yeah, Claire, perhaps if I can just add something here.
Of course, yes.
I think we have to And we have to start with the principle that, or at least this is the approach that we have at OECD, that most OECD test guidelines are applicable to nanomaterials. Okay, so you will have the list in the OECD website. And then, and I think I mentioned this in my presentation, we did find out that in some cases, there was a need to adapt certain test guidelines for their use in nanomaterials, and in some other cases, you will need to develop new test guidelines for nanomaterials. So the documents that Eric has included in his presentations are those documents that have been developed for the for testing nanomaterials. But please do this distinction, because, for example, the test guidelines on inhalation toxicity study, so you have the short 28 days and 90 days studies. Those were originally done for general chemicals and later on adapted so they could also include nanomaterials, because those ones were identified as not applicable to them. So in principle, if you're testing nanomaterials, you should go to the OECD test guidelines and they should be applicable to them. Now we have guidance documents that provide assistance on that. For example, we have a very recent one on aquatic and sediment ecotoxicity testing. The guidance document number, I think, is 317. And it will give you guidance on how to apply a number of existing test guidelines when you are testing nanomaterials. So there are no amendments needed on those test guidelines. You just need to make sure that you have this additional information at hand when you're going to use, when you're going to test the nanomaterials. Thank you.
That's great. No, that's an excellent addition. Thank you very much indeed, Ma. And what I should say, what I meant to say at the beginning is that with the overwhelming response we had to the webinar, I am delighted to say that with the recordings on YouTube between their publication yesterday morning and the meeting today, we have had over 925 views of those. So it looks like to be a very popular set of presentations. So I'm very happy that we did it this way in the end. So we now move to our second group of questions, which was really more around specific test guidelines. And there were more questions received in this area, but some of them were extremely specific and complex. So it would be easier for us to respond to those as a written response in the FAQ document. So we'll start with some of the test guideline specific questions, and dustiness is always a very popular one. And so one of the starting questions was, what is the current situation on the test guideline for dustiness? And I hand over to Thomas for this one.
Thanks a lot, Claire. And yes, dustiness is an important question and an important test parameter, but it's also a question which is not so easy to answer, because the test guideline guidance document developments for dustiness is not only one. We are looking into dustiness testing for spherical or near spherical or normal particles, and we look into dustiness testing for fibers, which is one differentiation which is ongoing. And another one is the use of the data, whether the use of the data is for exposure assessment, dustiness, or whether it is used for ATEX for explosive materials and for explosive assessments. And hence, there are test guideline developments and guidance document developments. And therefore, there is not only one answer possible on the current situation. The testing for the dustiness for particles is now starting with the round-robin tests. The guidance, the work for the guidance documents on the use for exposure assessment and on the use for ATEX for explosive explosion assessments is ongoing, and the dustiness testing for fibers is in the starting phase, but we hope to have the starting of the round-robin test within the next year. So that is the current status. And have seen the dustiness questions also for the next one. I would continue. The current situation, you get the information about that one, for example, by during the Nanoharmony workshop in 3rd to 5th of November. And there's also the other possibility to get in contact with Nanoharmony or in contact with the current coordinator for the dustiness test guideline and guidance document development, which is INARIS. So if you write to us, to Nanoharmony, we will happily pass on so that you can have a direct contact with those being involved in the development, scientific developments for the test guideline, which for dustiness, the case is the lead is with France, which is the member country coordinating it in the OECD, and the research coordinated for the dustiness is done by INARIS in France as well. Yeah, that's so far, I think, to dustiness.
Okay, that's lovely. And that includes the target completion date for the dustiness.
Yes, I didn't say a specific date because we have guidance documents and test guidelines within the view. For the particle, the test guideline, we assume to have it ready within the next 2-3 years.
That's great, thank you. And so that brings us to the next question associated with specific test guidelines. And I think this one is for Mar. It's how is the current situation of test guidelines for number-based particle size distribution?
So for the test guidelines on particle size distribution, I think it's quite advanced. And what we expect to have is to have test guidelines, a draft test guideline that can be circulated for a final review at the end of the year. So we hope that it can be approved in April 2020. And then the time that it goes through the usual OECD process for its publication, so it should be available. We hope that the test guideline is publicly available in June. One thing perhaps that is of interest to the audience is that once we are in the final stages of the revision of a test guidelines, the drafts are posted on the public website, on the OECD public website, and we welcome comments from anyone that is interested to provide inputs and to provide questions, and that should be taken into account in the final revision of this document.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Mar. So that takes us to the end of the test guideline specific questions. And as I said before, there are others that we will respond with in writing, as it fits better in a written format than in a spoken format now. So we had a few more questions also linked more generally to the project. And so one of the first questions was like really focusing on what potential for further test guidelines there are. So it was approximately 8 test guidelines and guidance documents are shown that will be pursued by Nanomet and Nanoharmony. What additional test guidelines or guidance documents could be included within these 2 projects, and how would that be decided? So that is going straight back to Thomas as the coordinator of Nanoharmony.
Thanks a lot, Claire, and thanks a lot for that question as well, because it's exactly what the purpose of Nanoharmony and Nanomet is. So yes, we have the possibility to, within the project of Nanoharmony, to sponsor the work for 8 test guideline guidance document developments directly. But as a CSA action, it's not only this work package. We have 2 other work packages specifically dedicated to looking into the OECD and research process and regulatory processes, how to improve the flow of information. And secondly, one of our tasks is to help and facilitate the coordination of all the developments related to test guidelines and guidance documents to make them fit for the use for nanomaterials. So any further work is very much welcome, and it can be included in future workshops and in future activities we do within Nanoharmony. And we facilitate this by bringing together the international experts from the scientific sides and the experts coming from the OECD side. This is the close collaboration which we need between Nanomet and Nanoharmony. So, and we can facilitate that and put that into perspective of all the other test guidelines which are developed. This is specifically of importance because if you have one endpoint and then other endpoints and they are somehow interlinked, it is important that there's an exchange and flow of information from one test guideline development to another. And this is why we, when Nanoharmony do not work closely only with EU-related test guideline guidance document developments, but happily include and try to facilitate the flow of information between all of them. And thus far, it is very welcome to actually participate, name, and you get the chance then that we can work all together on this issue.
That's great. Thank you very much, Thomas. And it is very closely linked to the next question, which is how can the projects include data from previous EU projects? Because of course, all through Horizon 2020, a significant number of projects around the characterization assessment of nanomaterials have been funded, and many of them very large. So it's important that the data from these it has legacy and is carried over. So Thomas, could you describe how data from other projects has been included here?
This is one obligation we already have from the beginning, that when we work on test guideline, on the research side for test guideline developments or guidance document, that we build our test guidelines and data on data and research which was done in previous European projects. And there's great work done within the nano safety cluster, where we already work together, and we have an exchange and flow of information from Nanoharmony and test guidelines to the different ongoing EU projects, and also to those which have been recently, more recently been finished. And there has been a list compiled by Flemming Cassé, who is responsible and working on this issue within the nano safety cluster by the European Commission. So where we actually clearly show which endpoint is related to which project, so that we can see where can we derive data from and use them for validation, which Mar was introducing before and explaining the validation process, that we can build and use those round-robin tests already as a background or as additional validation data for the validation report for the OECD for the test guideline. So yes, it is possible. Yes, we are reaching out. We are the nano safety cluster. If you from other EU projects, national projects, think you have important data, you are very welcome to contact us, and we will see how we can get them involved. So here again, by workshop, expert participation, collaboration with other projects, that's how we try to get the flow of information and data included here without taking over the data, but we certainly fulfill all requirements that the original data belong to those people who have actually produced them.
Thank you very much. And this also links into the next question, which is how other research projects can contribute scientific data into Nanoharmony.
Yes, that is very closely related to that one. As said before, this is what relates to workshops where they can say we have specific endpoints or SOPs or specific validation processes, that we have an exchange, that we see how it fits to the ongoing test guideline developments, and also to those which are anticipated. For example, NanoRigo is working on gap analysis, which I will introduce and say maybe a little bit later on. So we will see and try to coordinate it. And again, as a CSA action, coordination support action of the for OECD test guideline developments, this is part of our task where we try to facilitate.
That's super. And yes, at the end of this presentation, you will see all the details of how you can get involved in Nanoharmony activities. And so that brings to the final question that was submitted through the online survey, which was, will Nanoharmony address the adaptation of other genotox assays besides micronucleus into nanomaterials? So, and this stays with Thomas. So could you address that, Thomas?
Certainly. First of all, it is not Nanoharmony deciding on a test guideline or guidance document development or not, as was said clearly before. Within Nanoharmony, we cannot work on research related to test guideline development to new endpoints, which genotoxicity assay or micronucleus testing would be. On the other hand, as working on gap analysis, looking for which kind of endpoint is needed, or where do we have really practical and usable and regulatory sensible tests, So in this way, it may come up during the workshops, or specific sessions can be organized, leading towards an activity that a member country takes over and says, yes, this is something which should be developed, which should be part of the test guidelines by the OECD. And so that in this way, we actually get a genotoxicity assay or the other points included as Nanoharmony, not as a test guideline, not as specific funding of any research related to the test guideline development, but we facilitate through workshops and showing the flow of information and having the possibility to exchange with the different member countries and their regulatory representatives, that we try to see whether it's important and how we can get this going.
That is great. Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of our pre-prepared set of questions that all the viewers very kindly submitted online. And now I'm going to hand over to Klaus to address some of the questions that we received through the chat function in the webinar today. So are you okay to start that, Klaus?
I am, yeah. I've stuck them in a Word document and emailed it to you if you want to put them on screen. There's a few people that are struggling with audio, but they're not getting much out of the answers then.
Right, I
will read the first ones out while Claire does that. One is for you, Eric, that I've emailed to you. It's about dissolution rates. As you've indicated, GD 318 is now available. However, there's still a lot of uncertainty around how to best optimize experimental designs for this test. Again, you rightly indicated that it is critical endpoint for each, which can dictate, e.g. the testing for ecotox, testing strategy for ecotox, whether long or short term should be executed, or if dissolution test is fast enough to allow the registration to use the data based on iron for metals, for instance. Considering the uncertainty, should someone have conducted the test before finalization of the TG and use only the GD that are currently available? Do you believe the results using the recommendations will be robust and relevant enough to use, and are they able to reliably inform testing strategy? There you go, Eric.
Thanks, Klaus, for reading all that out loud. What I gather here is from the question is that there is now indeed guidance document on dissolution testing and dispersion stability, but not yet a test guideline that is for dissolution stability. So there is some uncertainty in what you have to do there. The guidance document describes quite detailed how such dissolution testing could be done, but it's not as strict as what you would expect from a test guideline. So indeed, there's some uncertainty there. Nevertheless, I think that there is quite some information that is useful for conducting such a test, and if a dissolution test dissolution is fast enough to allow registration to use the data based on ions for metals, that clearly depends on several things. The best way to convince a regulator, if you want to use that in a regulatory setting, those data, is probably present both a dissolution test and a test on or concentrations on your ion, so at least you have some comparison there. But still, it will depend on to some extent on your regulator, and discussions with your regulator are probably good. More in general, it's for whatever test guideline. I mean, the dissolution is a clear difficult one and a clear critical parameter. But in general, if you have doubts whether a test guideline is fully applicable for your nanomaterial, discussions with your regulator who you want to accept the data is generally a good first step, I would say.
Excellent. I'm hoping that answered the question. It's obviously hard to find out in this larger forum with nearly 250 people still here. Do you want to take the next one as well?
Yes.
It's sort of a follow-on.
It's yeah.
Yeah.
Let me digest it a bit.
You want me to read it out while you're digesting, Eric?
Yeah, that would be helpful.
Yeah, that's great. Then it helps other people
Because
who may not be able to see the screen.
And
so
it's
clearly.
Yeah, it's very small on my screen as well. So.
So further on dissolution and in general, if dissolution tests are executed now, will there be longevity in the result? Or do you think that it could be that retesting may be required? Which parts are we more confident with more in inverted commas? The implications of retesting are both time consuming and not cost effective and may lead to an unnecessary number of animals being tested. Similar questions could apply to other guidance documents where the topic contained within these pertains to test methods for which more specific test guidelines are currently being worked on. And I certainly know that this is the same type of question we've had a lot with the implementation of the new REACH annexes for nanomaterials with regard to justification of sets in terms of worrying about having to retest things in the future where tests may not be particularly well validated now. So Eric, have you digested that enough to answer?
Yeah, I think so. It is a valid question, and I think it's more general than dissolution alone. It's basically asking if we do a test now with nanomaterials with a test guideline by OECD that may later on not be fully applicable, or I'm testing nanomaterials where I could have relied on ion toxicity and thus didn't need a test at all. Those are very valid questions, and again, I'm sorry for repeating myself, but in those cases where you think you have these issues, a very first step would be to discuss with the regulators who ask you for those data. If you come up with a plan like, I think I can do it this and this way, go in a discussion and see if the regulator can accept your plan ahead. And for more specifically for REACH, there is the obligation that you keep your dossier up to date. So fully you cannot fully prevent that new tests will be needed in the future, but clearly you hope to avoid that new tests will be needed within the next couple of years. But we cannot go much further than that, I would say.
Excellent. Thanks, Eric. There's the medical device one below, I think, is possibly a bit out of our normal sphere of comfort here, but there's a helpful reply in the chat from Malaysia that says, to the query related to medical devices, suggest you refer to ISO TR, and you can find the numbers there because you will need to copy them, on biological evaluation of medical devices, part 22, guidance on nanomaterial. So I don't know whether Eric or Thomas, you have anything else to say on medical device testing, but I think the ISO guideline is probably the best reference.
Right, and I think one point can be made here that medical devices is not a focus in a chemical safety testing program of the OECD, but Mar may know that better than me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for the test guidelines we talk about preclinical tests only. So we're not talking about medical devices here. So it's out of our scope.
Yeah. Okay, so Claire, if you go to the top of that document, there's a few small questions there as well.
Okie doke. excuse the slight informality of the Word document. We're sort of now doing this in real time as questions come through the chat. So the first one is for me. How long will the YouTube video stay available? And that should be until the end of time, as we don't plan to take them down, and we already have ones that are 4 or 5 years old. So there is no time limit on this video.
And perhaps I can answer the next ones, Klaus.
Yeah, please do.
So no, I mean, what I'm saying is that most test guidelines are applicable for nanomaterials because at OECD we did a review of the existing test guidelines at the time, and I do want to stress this at the time, where we're looking at what could be the most pressing need for nanomaterials. One thing that I want to mention here is we don't. In the test guidelines program and in the OECD, our approach is not to exclusively for nanomaterials unless there is a specific need. So our test guidelines are for chemicals, including nanomaterials. It is true that in some cases there are some nano not applicable, and in this case, is when we try to develop guidance documents. But I do sense the frustration here that there are not all the tools, necessary tools for responding to regulatory needs are yet developed, and I take the point there. But as Eric said, I mean, regulators work they are part of the OECD, they're part of the discussions, so they're the best ones to advise when there is a specific doubt about the applicability of a test guidelines, and if there is a missing guidance document on how to adapt the test guidelines so it can be accepted by the data requirement that you have in front. So I think I think I'm trying to answer the two questions here from Mr. Kamaldin and from Gunther Van Kerchove. So yes, the test guidelines, not all are yet available. That's why there are 18 projects underway within the OECD, and that we foreseen that after that we will have some additional ones to come to our end. As you know, science is also advancing quite fast, so test guidelines are updated on a regular basis as long as we have the scientific data that can assist us or can allow us to do those adaptations, and that we can validate the test. So it's quite there's quite there's a lot of work that needs to be done in advance for those test guidelines, and yes, I think yes, I take the point, and I take the point that yes, it's not applicable to all. But it's what we have right now, and it's what we're trying to cope to assist regulators, to assist the industry to submit their commercial applications.
Excellent. Thank you, Ma. There's a follow-up to that, which is it would be useful if we could have a source document that indicates the OECD's view on the applicability of other test guidelines to convince relevant regulatory authorities. I'm guessing that's more of a list of exclusion in terms of which ones needed reviewing, but that's something we can put in the follow-up documentation, Claire. I'll keep a note of it.
Yeah, I take the point. I have taken the note, and I will include some links and some reference there. But I'm sure that I can convince regulatory authorities. I mean, regulatory authorities are seated in our meetings, and they're the ones approving the documents. So again, I mean, they are well aware about the areas, the missing areas that are not yet addressed, and but I will do my best to respond to that one. Thank you.
Thank you. And then there's a slightly more procedural question of how does a non-member country contribute or suggest modifications, if any, to OECD TG? Okay, so we have we have a procedure for non-OECD members to participate in our meetings. So we do have, for example, we have worked a lot, we have MAD adherence, for example, non-OECD countries that have adhered to MAD. So for example, you will have Argentina, Brazil,
Indonesia, India, Thailand, I think last week, and South Africa that they provide inputs. If you're not, we have China, for example, participating in our meetings and providing inputs. But in case of doubt, I will be pleased if you can contact me. The contact details are in my slides. At the end, you have my email. You can contact me and I will be very pleased to help you and to assist you to participate or to help you to clarify what is the process to provide input. And as I also mentioned in the OECD website, if you look OECD test guidelines, and also there is a link in my presentation, you can see a link to draft test guidelines and draft guidance documents, which are under the final review procedures. So you can also submit inputs through this through the forms that are available there.
Thank you. And that might slightly address the last question that's just come in from Kai in terms of where's the best source for which TGs are currently being researched, available as drafts, available as final for possible final revisions. So again, Claire, I think we'll find a way of putting the links to those places, either in tables that we make or in direct links on the website.
Klaus,
yep.
May I add with regard to the list that we, in coordination between Nanoharmony, Gov4Nano, some EU projects and Nanomet, preparing a list which we will make available at the nano safety cluster level and also to OECD and others, where we show which test guideline endpoints are ongoing, the brief status, and we also have a list of possible further endpoints which may come up in the future. So this kind of list, I don't know where MAR will make it available at the OECD level, but we discussed it and we will make it available via several channels.
Yeah, okay. While they're coming in fast now, so there's one about how does the OECD collaborate in development of testing regimes with the ISO TC 229 nanotechnologies committee. I don't know, Ma, if you want to comment on that.
Hold on, I've been appointed, okay. Oh, I mean, ISO TC 229, we collaborate with them on a daily basis. They are part of the work that we're doing on the nano safety, and several experts from ISO TC 229 are also experts in several our expert groups assisting the development of the test guidelines and guidance documents. So if you're part of ISO, you can either contact me or contact Dennis Kosko, the chair of ISO, or your working group, I think it's working group that you call them in ISO, working group convener, and just get in touch with me. I mean, this is a collaboration that is long-standing, I think, for the last 12 years. So it's we will be happy to enforce that.
Excellent, thank you. Then I'm going to take the one from Phil Sayer, and then I'm going to scoot back up and find the ones that were left behind before. So from Phil Sayer, given the number of TGs and GDs still needed beyond the 8 addressed in these 2 programs, are there any EU funding programs that will now or soon address these needs? If so, what are they, please? Or is it all up to the member countries of the OECD to fund and pursue? I think that's what Thomas would give you a very long speech on, but hopefully he can do a short answer given we got 9 minutes left.
Involved a little bit from the side of asking for funding and not on the side of giving a lot of funding. So certainly we were very happy to have funding from some national member countries of the OECD, as well as getting funding for 2-3 projects clearly related to the OECD test guideline developments. The future, those coming from Europe knows that Horizon 2020 has finished and Horizon Europe is at the horizon. So it is not very clear in the moment where and how there will be some funding available, but we certainly are asking for it because there will be continuous effort, not only here for nano, but also some for advanced and other materials, coming up in the future. So to have that on a longer lasting or on a longer timeline than just having projects of 3 years is quite important, as seen from the nano safety cluster, as far as I know.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Then I'm going to go slightly up the chat line to some of the earlier questions. These are probably for you, Eric, at least for a starter. So if the TG is not adequate for nanomaterials for things like toxicokinetics, how is ECHA brackets going to accept this in regarding the involved REACH dossiers? What happens when an accepted TG is for some type of the nanoform not technically feasible to perform for the involved endpoint?
That's first of all, I'm not ECHA, so how ECHA will respond is always a bit difficult to predict. But I think what ECHA generally does, if these things are, if OECD test guidelines are not available and something is really needed because REACH asked for it, they will come up with some guidance themselves. To what extent they can give that guidance clearly also depends on scientific basis for any given guidance. And if the scientific basis isn't there, it's clearly difficult for them also to come up with guidance. Again, if you have doubts, just start a dialogue with the regulators and see where you can go to provide data that will be acceptable for the regulators and the requirements.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And then I guess this is the last one I've spotted so far that we haven't partially dealt with. It's slightly open, so I don't know, we'll have to interpret it a bit. It's what are the tests required under environmental fate for nanomaterials? I'm guessing that depends on which regulation you're trying to apply to. Do you want to comment on which ones are under development apart from an OECD point of view? So things like that, I mean, there's the ones that you've mentioned in your presentations, of course, that we're working on in Nanoharmony, but I don't know whether you know if there's others.
Yeah, first of all, I indeed like to point out that it depends a bit on the legislation, what the requirements are. And on the environmental fate side, definitely dissolution is an important parameter, as is dispersion. Well, we've already discussed the developments there, I would say, and we can maybe provide a few more details in the afterwards in the frequently asked questions. I'm not sure if this already answered enough, but and I cannot find the exact question in the chat. I'm not sure where we are.
It's up quite a way. It literally just said.
Which time point do we?
There's no time on it, but it says what are the tests required on the environmental fate of nanomaterials.
Yeah, it's difficult. I think things like bioaccumulation also fall under the fate, at least in OECD, and in many legislations that is a requirement on environmental fate. Developments are ongoing there to, on the one hand, ensure that sufficient guidance is given to enable fish tests according to the TG 305 bioaccumulation test. And on the other hand, just a new project has started to come up with alternatives for that fish test, so that fish tests may not always be needed.
Okay, good. There's one more in the Google document, Claire, but I don't know whether you think we got time to squeeze it in.
Yeah, do you want to just read it out? We
yeah,
scheduled
so
it's an hour, but let's wrap it up after this one.
Okay, so it says, how will the consistent consistency of reference data characterization impact the decisions of standards the standards could be based on? So how will the consistency of reference data characterization impact the decisions standards could be based on? I'm not even sure I know what it means.
I'm not sure if he's referring out whether the information is repeatable.
Yeah.
And that can be, but that's part of the validation process on whether you can repeat the test and have consistent results across different laboratories following a specific method. And this is, so this definitely will affect whether your test methods can be accepted by a regulator.
Yeah.
If that was the question though.
Yep. Well, that was the question. And the last ones is our toxicity test going to be based only on the biochemical assays? Would the guidelines include physico-mechanical and in silico methods, new toxicity testing approaches? I'm guessing that's the hope that in time they will once the standard gets developed.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's a clean sheet, Claire.
That's fantastic. So I will wrap up the question side of this webinar by saying I hope that was very useful in terms of the questions that were submitted and have been answered by our expert panel. What we will do after this is put everything that we have received and answered in writing, so that will make hopefully a useful FAQs document that we will share through both OECD and MAR and also through Nanoharmony. I will also share it a little bit further. It will be a fully publicly available document, although of course we will not include people's names in terms of who submitted questions. It will be fully anonymized. So what I will do is click back to the final few slides of our presentation before everybody gets to go and have a very well-earned cup of coffee. What we will do after this is that we will make all the presentations, the first 3 that are already out there on YouTube, plus this recording available on YouTube in perpetuity. And that will be accessible through the Nanoharmony website and through the Nanomet project web pages. So that you will be able to come back to this. As I've already said, you will also be able to see the FAQs that we will pull together after this webinar and hope that they are very helpful for you. And you can also go to the OECD website to look at the different testing requirements on chemicals and the current status of test guidelines, so that you can see what information is out there. All of these links will be available in this slide set, which we will also share with you. So all of these links will be live and all registered delegates will be able to receive these directly after this webinar. So this is an ongoing conversation. So we would invite you very much to stay involved. So there are a number of ways that you can stay involved and ask questions and both contribute your own expertise into future activities. Primarily through Nanoharmony, but also through Nanomet, with whom we will be doing many of our activities jointly. So just coming up, it's been referenced already that we have an expert workshop over 3 days in November. Not all of that workshop is open. A lot of it is closed expert groups speaking around specific topics. However, there will be a plenary session open at the end of that workshop on November the 5th, where you will see the initial outcomes that have emerged from all those expert groups that have contributed into it. So you can register to take part in that. That will get you an initial look at the outcomes from that. Then we will follow that up with our next Nanoharmony webinar, which will be on the 16th of December, which will present a much broader and more fully assessed outcomes from the expert workshop. So that should give you a really good idea of the direction of travel for the type of scientific data that is available to support the development of test guidelines and guidance documents, plus the type of international activities that will be taking place around those. And for sure in Nanoharmony, that's going to extend quite for the next 2 years. So there's a substantial amount of development that can go into these test guidelines and the directions documents. So those are the 2 next events coming up in 2020 that you can be involved with. And again, you'll be able to click into both of those activities when we send you the slides. And then finally, I would really recommend that you sign up to the Nanoharmony newsletter, of which you'll see the first edition of that coming out in September, because that will give you all of the progress to date in terms of what the project has been doing, the outcomes, and the opportunities to be involved in that. And it also means that we can send you updates and invite you to future things like this much more easily. And again, you'll be able to click through this slide to get to the newsletter. So that was, in fact, my last slide, as you can see. So I will close this webinar today by saying a huge thank you to all of our presenters, because they worked really hard pulling this together. We really wanted these projects to be as open and accessible as possible. And with over 850 registrants and nearly 1,000 presentation views so far for this particular webinar, we were absolutely stunned by the level of interest in this kind of activity, particularly from outside the EU and particularly from industry. So we were really pleased to see that this is a highly relevant project, and we hope through initiatives such as the Malta Initiative that we will continue to see good coordinated international efforts around this to support the work that the OECD does. So I will end by saying thank you very much to you guys for putting up with my many emails on the topic and making it all safely into our new Zoom platform. We will wrap this up as quickly as possible and share with you the recording and the slides. And of course, you can follow up with any further queries. So thank you once more. So you're now free to go, and I will close the webinar shortly, and we will follow up to all registered delegates. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Claire. Well done.
Thanks, Claire.
No, well done, everybody. So I'm going to switch this off now.